Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you're new here. My name is Sarah Jane. I am a PR practitioner living in DC. I make a lot of content on living in DC and books. So if that type of content interests you, then be sure to give this channel a thumbs up and subscribe because it really helps support my channel. A couple weeks ago, I did the mid-year book tag where essentially I talked about the books that I really have enjoyed thus far in 2023. And there was a list of questions and I went based off the questions. I have since realized since filming that video that I didn't get to talk about all the books that I've read up to this point, and so I thought this video would be the perfect time to just chit chat about all the books that I've read so far in 2023. So I am cutting off my timeline in terms of like what I consider as mid-year at the beginning of June 1st. So these are all books that I've read prior to June. A lot of people, when they talk about the books they've read so far, they normally do it in chronological order, like I read this first, then I read this first, then I read this first. And I just felt like that might be a little confusing, so I thought I would split it out by genres. Up to this point, I have read 16 books so far, which is super exciting. I have a goal of reading 30 by the end of the year, so I am on track to meet that goal. So we're actually gonna start with my favorite genre, which is suspense and thrillers. I've actually read 7 thrillers or suspense novels so far. It is my favorite genre and it just makes me really happy. I love getting swept up in the story, thinking that I know what's gonna happen, and then at the end it just like completely takes a turn. I love when an author can keep me guessing. Starting out, we have the Inheritance Games trilogy. Now I only have 2 here with me. I let a friend borrow the 3rd one. Essentially, we are following the story of Avery Graham. She comes from a less than fortunate background, but her luck changes in an instant when billionaire Tobias Hawthorne dies and leaves her virtually his entire fortune. The only catch, Avery must move into his sprawling mansion full of secret passages, riddles, and codes. Unfortunately for Avery, Hawthorne House is also occupied by the family that has just been disinherited. This includes the 4 Hawthorne grandsons, dangerous magnetic boys who grew up with every expectation that one day they would inherit billions. Heir apparent Grayson is convinced that Avery is a con woman and he's determined to take her down, but his brother Jameson views her as his grandfather's last hurrah. A twisted riddle, a puzzle to be solved, caught in a world of wealth and privilege with danger around every turn, Avery will have to play the game herself just to survive. I do think these are technically YA novels, but they're really fun. They move very quickly and it's a really good time. There is actually a 4th novel coming out, which I'd be really interested. I think it's called The Hawthorne's Legacy, because the trilogy really wrapped up everything really nicely, but the Hawthorne Legacy is supposed to be focusing specifically on the 2 oldest brothers, which we love anyway as the reader. So this was full of riddles and passages and big houses, and it's just a really fun, lighthearted suspense. I wouldn't say it's a thriller, but a suspense. I rated the first one 4 stars, the second one, which is a purple cover, 4.5 stars, and then the last one 4 stars. So overall, this was a pretty good 4-star read. Next up, we have The Guest List by Lucy Foley. This was my first time reading Lucy Foley, and I really enjoyed it. It essentially follows the premise of a wedding taking place in a remote Irish island. There is a secret, there's a murder, and there's ultimately multiple motives. The whole storyline centers around a group of friends that have come together for this wedding. So it's definitely a very whodunit. I really enjoyed this book. I rated it 4 stars. I remember reading it over my honeymoon and just like flipping through and just trying to figure out, which is really funny because I had just gotten married, right? And this is about a wedding. So I remember flipping through and just being so captivated and thinking I know who did it. And there was a complete plot twist at the end, which I love. But this was a 4-star read for me. After completing that book, I really enjoyed Lucy Foley, so I wanted to read something else from her. So I picked up The Hunting Party. Right off the bat, something I noticed about Lucy Foley is she sort of follows a very similar structure. A group of friends, going to some place that's really remote. The guest list was in Ireland, but this book was in Scotland, in the Scotland wilderness. I believe there are 8 people that are friends from school that come together, and they're in different places of their life now. Some are parents, some are married now, so the friend dynamic has really changed, but it's really important to this group that they still spend time together. So they go on this hunting party, and I don't remember exactly what they're hunting, but some sort of animal, and then there ends up being a murder, and it's once again a who done it, but they're remote, so they can't like have really good cell service. I still really enjoyed this book. I believe I gave it 3.75 stars, only because I did not think it was as engaging as the guest list, nor did I enjoy the fact that it kind of followed a similar structure. I was really hoping for something different. So this is still a good read, and I might have liked it more if I hadn't already read the guest list. We'll see, maybe, but I decided to take a break from Lucy Foley after this. There's another one from her called The Paris Apartment that I really want to read, but I'm waiting to read it until I feel like enough time has passed. The last suspense thrillers that I've read so far this year is by Freida McFadden. It's a duology, and that is The Housemaid and The Housemaid's Secret. So the first book follows Millie. She's recently got out of jail and she needs a job. She's been living out of her car, so she applies for a housemaid position for an affluent family. It's a live-in position, so she moves into the attic and she realizes that the door only closes from the outside, and that's kind of all I really want to say without giving too much away. This was a phenomenal 5-star read for me. I absolutely loved this book. I have recommended to everyone that I know. This completely just kept me on my toes the entire time. So after reading this book, I decided to also pick up The Housemaid Secret, which we're still following Millie, but this time she has now moved. She's living in New York. I believe she's living in the Bronx at this point, and she is a housemaid again, this time for a different family who's living on the Upper West Side. For this family, the wife is living upstairs, but she keeps her door locked, and Millie isn't supposed to talk to her. The husband has given very strict orders about this. Well, one day, Millie comes to clean the house and there's blood on the carpet, and it leads to that door. She says through the door to the woman that she's not going to leave, and she will call the police if she does not at least see that she's okay, and the woman opens the door. So that's all I really want to say about that book. I also love this book. I gave this book 4.5 stars only because I felt like the pacing was a little off for me. The first book just kept me guessing, everything kept moving. This one felt like it sort of sat sometimes, but other than that, I still really enjoyed it. So if you're looking for a good suspense thriller, something that's gonna keep you interested, if you're going through like a book slump or anything, I highly recommend these 2 books. So those are the 7 suspense thriller books that I've read so far this year. Once again, my favorite genre. So if you have any recommendations for suspense or thrillers, please leave them in the comments below, because I just love to read this genre, especially with fall around the corner. It's like the perfect thing to read during the fall season. So next up is fantasy. Fantasy is actually the least amount of books that I've read so far this year, for a specific reason, but let's talk about first the one fantasy book that I've read so far. That book is A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. So I read all of the ACOTAR books, except this one, last year, and it was such an adventure. It was so exciting. I absolutely love that series. I've never been a fantasy reader until I picked up the ACOTAR series, and then I've been absolutely hooked. I love Sarah J. Maas. I love her writing style. I love her world building. Everything about it is amazing. So when I finished this book, this was actually the very first book I read of the year in January. I wanted to take a break from fantasy. I haven't read another fantasy book since until June, and then in July I've actually picked up another fantasy book, so I will talk about that later in my July book wrap. But up to this point, I'd only read this one fantasy book, just because, like I said, I didn't want to be disappointed by a different fantasy reader. I did want to read some of the other series that Sarah J. Maas has out, but I just wasn't ready to do it yet. Like, I wanted to give this one time to breathe and like live. So essentially, this follows the story of Nesta and her relationship with not only herself, but Cassian. I mean, that is sort of like sprinkled throughout the whole ACOTAR series, but there's finally a book dedicated to her. I ended up rating this book 4.5 stars. I really loved this book. I loved being able to get back into that world. I loved finally seeing their love story sort of play out. It felt really real, really authentic. It wasn't perfect either. They both have like a lot of flaws, but I think that's what makes the book so great, is because it's relatable. So if you haven't read the ACOTAR series, which I feel like everyone has at this point, but if you have not, I highly recommend it. All right, moving on to romance. I only have 2 romance books that I've read so far this year. This honestly isn't a genre that I really prefer to read a lot of. So the way I view romance is if you take the love out of it, you can no longer have the story. But if you take a fantasy book, for example, and you take the romance out, the plot can still continue. It's not like a bigger part of the story. So for me, I personally really enjoy when romance is a subplot instead of the main plot. But I did pick up 2 romance books so far this year. So the first one is Happy Place by Emily Henry. This is her most recent release. This is also my first time reading Emily Henry. I've heard a lot about her, but I have not actually picked up one of her books. So this was the first book that I picked up. I mean, it's cute. Like, how can you not pick up this book? So unfortunately for me, I am against the popular opinion, which is that I did not actually really like this book. I rated it only 3 stars. So essentially it follows the story of Harriet and Wynn, who have been engaged, and they're part of this friend group since school. So every year they go up to this cottage in Maine for the Lobster Fest with their friend group, and they spend some time together. Harriet and Wynn have broken off their engagement, but they don't want to tell their friends, and then they both end up going on this trip because they always end up going on this trip. And the whole plot essentially follows this friend group in Maine and them trying not to tell their friends what's going on, so they're still acting like they're engaged. Overall, the plot is fine, but for me, my issue with this book is that the whole premise is about miscommunication. Like, Harriet and Wynn can't seem to communicate with one another. No one in the friend group seems to be able to communicate with one another. And I just thought the whole thing was strange because these people have been friends for so long, but yet they can't seem to talk to one another, especially Harriet and Wynn, because you've been engaged and now you magically just can't seem to talk to one another. I think I should also probably say, I mean, I do work in communications, right? So like my whole thing that I do professionally is communicate with people. For me to watch a whole array of miscommunication just drove me nuts. So I don't think the writing is bad or anything like that. I just don't think I actually preferred the plot. But I know everyone else really likes this book. I am gonna give Emily Henry another try. I do have Beach Read on my TBR, so I will be reading that later this summer. The other romance book I've read so far this year is Archer's Voice by Mia Sheridan. I am also not with the popular opinion in the fact that I didn't really particularly care for this book, and I gave it 3 stars. Essentially, this follows the story. Who does this follow? What is her name? Essentially, this follows the story of Bree. She moves to Maine. Oh wow, both stories are set in Maine. But so she moves to Maine to kind of get away from some things that are troubling her in her past, and this is like a place to refresh for her. She meets a guy named Archer who is mute. They have an affinity towards one another because she used to sign language with her father, and so she was able to speak to Archer through sign language. There's really 2 subplots going on. One is what happened to Archer that made him lose his voice. The other subplot is what has happened to Bree in the past that has made her run away to Maine, and the focal plot is their love story. I don't think there's anything wrong with Mia Sheridan's like writing style or overall the plot. Like, it's fine. I just think it wasn't to my taste. Like, I think everybody has their preferred taste, and I think for me, because romance isn't my preferred genre, I just think for me it just didn't hit home. But so many people really do love this book, so if you are really into romance and this type of story interests you, I would definitely recommend giving it a try. It just isn't my forte. Okay, moving into our last genre, which is fiction, just general fiction. I've read 6 books so far in general fiction, so let us get into them. Let's start with one of my favorite authors, which is Taylor Jenkins Reid. I read Daisy Jones and the Six, and I freaking loved this book. This book was a 5-star read for me. It essentially follows Daisy Jones and the Six, which is a band. They from the start of their band, the inception of their band, to the peak of their career. And essentially it's told through an oral history format. So you don't actually know if anything is true because it's obviously biased towards whoever's being interviewed during the book. The main characters are Billy, who is the lead singer of the Six, Daisy Jones, which is a songwriter that ends up joining the Six, along with some other characters, but the other bigger one is Camilla, who is Billy's wife. There's a bit of a love triangle. We have enemies to lovers. We have forced proximity. There's just a lot of like really good tropes that are in here. And I just adored it. I loved this book. I thought it was an amazing storytelling piece, and I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in being swept away to a band in the 70s. It's based off of Fleetwood Mac, so if you're interested in that, you'll probably be interested in this. I personally am not into rock and roll bands, but I still really enjoyed this. Also by Taylor Jenkins Reid is Carrie Soto is Back, which is her newest novel. As much as I loved Daisy Jones and the Six, I actually did not love Carrie Soto is Back. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars, which is obviously vastly different from the 5 stars that I just gave to Daisy Jones and the Six. This essentially follows Carrie Soto, who she does make an appearance through some of TJR's other books, like in Malibu Rising she made an appearance. I also think she might have made an appearance in The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Essentially, Carrie Soto holds the record of the most grand slams, and she goes into retirement. The book starts from Carrie Soto watching as someone else is about to take her title as the most grand slams, so she decides to come out of retirement and get back into it so she can maintain that title. The reason why this book did not resonate with me was because of the tennis. Like, there was so much tennis, and I get it, it's about tennis. I felt like I knew everything about tennis by the time I was done with this book. And so I would just, if you pick up this book, I would just keep that in mind, that you're gonna learn a lot about tennis. So the next fiction book I read was Lessons in Chemistry. This is by Bonnie Garmus. This essentially follows the story of Elizabeth Zott, who is a chemist. So this is set in 1960s. She's working for an all-male team at Hastings Research Institute, where a lot of her work gets taken by some of her male colleagues. She's having a really rough time there, and she ends up meeting Calvin Evans. He's a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and they end up falling in love. But life happens, and Calvin is no longer in the picture, so Elizabeth finds that she's let go of her job and she has to figure out a way to make it work. So she goes on as a host for a cooking show, but she uses a lot of science terminology, but people love it and her ratings are crazy. This book essentially just follows that story, and it is exceptional. It's phenomenal. I loved this book. I thought it was so interesting. I don't even like biology or science, and I thought this was super interesting. I ended up giving this book 4.25 stars. It was so good. Like, I totally recommend picking it up. What I loved about the book was that it made me feel, and I love when a book can evoke emotion. I felt the love, I felt the pain, I felt the frustration, I just felt the hardships, and I felt everything through that book, and I really appreciated that. Next up is Pineapple Street. So this is by Jenny Jackson, which is her debut novel. This follows the story of 3 different women in New York. So you have 2 sisters and a sister-in-law. They all have like different storylines. So one sister has a lot of guilt from the amount of money that she comes from. One sister has a lot of grievances because she gave up her family money. And then the third sister, who is married into the family, has a lot of issues fitting in with the family and finding her place there. So you have 3 different storylines set in New York and Brooklyn, and you just follow it. And I think I really like this story because if you have not been following my channel for a while, I used to live in New York, and being able to follow in the footsteps of where they're going just felt like a warm, comfy hug. So I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving this book 4.25 stars. So the next book I read was The Measure by Nicki Erlick. This is also her debut novel. So this book follows the story of 8 different people, and essentially the premise is that one day everybody wakes up and they find out that there is a box outside their door, and inside that box contains a string. The length of the string indicates when you're going to die. So you have short stringers and long stringers. And then you also have people who like don't even open their box to see what's inside of it and then just live obliviously. I thought this was really interesting because I've never really read a book like this before. I wonder if this would fit really into the sci-fi category, but regardless, I think technically it's categorized as fiction. But I really enjoyed this book. You have a very diverse group of cast within the books. You have people in the military, you have a bisexual couple, you have politicians, you have teachers, you have all these different like kind of groups of people that you're following. So I really enjoyed the diversity within the cast. I rated it a 3.5 stars only because, well, 2 reasons. One, the pacing was a little bit slower than I would have preferred. It's definitely a character-driven novel, not a plot-driven novel, which I've realized that about myself. I do like a plot-driven novel. But then 2, you never actually find out where these strings come from, which irritated me. I'm someone who likes things to be like neatly tied up into a bow, and that's just me in like terms of like my preferences as a reader and what I want in a book. And so when that didn't happen in this book, and I don't think that's a spoiler really, but when that didn't happen in this book, I got very frustrated. The last book that I read so far this year, I actually don't have a copy of anymore because I've actually already donated it. So obviously you could probably tell that I didn't really like it. So that book is Panchinko by Min Jin Lee. So this book is set in the early 1900s. You meet a character named Sunja, and she essentially falls in love with a man and gets pregnant by him, but finds out that he's actually already married. He's a very wealthy man who is living in Japan, even though they're Korean. And her decision to not be his mistress and instead marry this other man, he's very honorable, but he's a sickly minister that doesn't have much more time to live. That essentially creates this saga of a multi-generational cast of a family. First of all, this is really a literary fiction, so the tone is a little bit more serious. The writing is paced a little bit differently than the types of books that I normally read. I felt like it was a little hard to read, and then 2, I didn't love, once again, that the ending wasn't really wrapped up in a bow. I don't want to say what happens, but essentially it ends and I'm kind of just like, what? So I didn't love that book, and I ended up rating it 2.5 stars, which is my worst rating so far this year. I hate to end it on that note, you guys, but those are the 16 books I've read so far in 2023. I'm on track to read 30 by the end of the year, which was one of my goals for this year, and I've just been really enjoying it. I love filling my mind with stories and really great stories. So if you guys have any recommendations of books that I should read, please let them in the comments below. I'm always looking for a really good book, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe because it really does help the algorithm and support my channel, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.